Welcome to Cartoon Creators, where we talk to the minds behind the shows that raised us. I'm your host, Tamar Lilienthal, and today we're talking to Adam Peltzman. Adam has been the head writer on Blue's Clues and the Backyardigans, and more recently created Wallykazam and co-created Odd Squad. He's also written on a number of other beloved children's shows, including Maya and Miguel and Wonder Pets. We chat about his start on Blue's Clues, his experience working with the beloved Janice Burgess on Backyardigans, and of course, we finally resolve the debacle of whether Green Puppy is a boy or a girl. So stay tuned. Let's get to the episode. Thank you so much, Adam, for coming on the podcast. We're super excited to have you.
Oh, happy to be here tomorrow.
So, I think I'll start off with the same question that we've asked all of our other guests, and we've heard so many cool, interesting stories of how people ended up in this field. So, what's your story? How'd you end up writing for kids media?
Yeah, well, I was lucky to get into it pretty shortly after college, but it was not with like a great sense of clarity and purpose. Like in college, I didn't know that I would do this.
Mm,
It sort of ended up being kind of like a hybrid of interests that sort of came together along with a couple of opportunities I was very, very lucky to have. Yeah, in college, I did a lot of writing. I did a lot of improv comedy. I also had an interest in education. Between doing some tutoring and some mentorship, but also and some education classes, but also after college for a summer, I happened to be living in the Bay Area at the time. I did like a teaching program. I taught middle school kids improv and writing,
oh,
creative writing. So yeah, I was sort of circling around kids and entertainment and writing and I had gotten a call that summer, and I was still like, what do I want to do? I knew I felt like I wanted to write, although I was also very much open to teaching. I got a phone call from somebody I knew at the time. My girlfriend's, how do I describe this? My girlfriend's like a family friend who I'd gotten to know pretty well, who worked as a composer in television in New York, a composer for a lot of things. Knew kind of what I was interested in. Knew I was interested in comedy and writing and all this stuff, and gave me a call and said, "Look, I just had lunch with somebody who's a at Scholastic Entertainment, and she's an executive, and they're looking for writers for this comedic project that's like about these two characters traveling cross country, and it's supposed to be very irreverent and funny, like more Marx Brothers and Pee Wee Herman than anything really cute and gentle." But anyway, they're looking for writers, and I thought of you. Do you have any spec scripts or anything like that? And I unfortunately did not.
oh
Uh,
man.
yeah, I know. I was like, oh, I no. I mean, I have like things I've written, in college, but nothing that's like in the zone of this. And he said, well, what you could do, he's like, here's like the one-liner of the concept. And by the way, this is very unconventional, but I'm glad I didn't really know that. It's about these two characters, this and that. He kind of gave me the basics. Why don't you write something up? And I said, yeah, I got really excited about that possibility. And it was about these characters traveling across the US. And I had, with my friends, had just traveled across the US on a road trip. So I had some stuff to pull from. So I was like, I'm going to write this about New Mexico and the desert. And I locked myself in a cafe for 5 days, just coming up with jokes and a rough story. And I just banged out a script. Um,
Wow.
yeah, it was like, I mean, I could tell it was a good opportunity because of how excited I was to do it. Looking back, I think the script was poorly formatted. It was very thin story. It was relentlessly punny. Like I just hammered the reader with like shamelessly with puns. But I do think it had, and I haven't really grown out of the puns either. But I, I do think it had a certain energy to it, undeniable kind of like I think my enthusiasm for doing it came through. And then so when this exec from Scholastic read it, she said to the mutual acquaintance we had, "Wow, this doesn't read like somebody who's been writing kids TV for 25 years," which by the way is kind of what I am now. But anyway, she's just like, I'd like to meet this guy. And so I had the chance to meet her, which was, she was based out of New York. I made the decision, even though there was no imminent job, I made the decision to move to New York. And so I moved back east and stayed with my parents a bit because I was like, this is what I want to do. I mean, of course, I was in California and might have been wise to go down to LA where there's even more television. I wasn't, I was 22. But anyway, so she did the sensible thing, which was she hired people with experience instead of, the guy who didn't know how to format a script. But like a month or so later, it didn't work out with those writers, and she actually came back to me and asked me to punch up their development materials and write a short script. So,
Oh,
um,
wow.
and it was like, all right, this is amazing. So I did that. It's fun. I was telling somebody this story recently because this is a while ago. This is like pre-cell phone. So she would call my parents' house where, and like my mom would pick up and she'd be like, oh, Sue's on the phone, and I'd pick up the phone. It was very unprofessional. It was kind of looking back. Um, but anyway, yeah, so she hired me. Her name is Sue Hollenberg, by the way, and now by coincidence we live in the same town, and she runs the Montclair, New Jersey film program. But anyway, it proved to me that it was something I really wanted to do. And then shortly after, a friend of mine that I'd gone to college with knew somebody that was staffing up for a new season of Blue's Clues, and they had an opening for a writing coordinator. Now Blue's Clues was like when I saw it, it was much younger than I even could imagine writing for. I mean, the thing I
Mm,
was kind of like, older and kind of very jokey and everything. But I I came to understand it was a very well thought out show. It had a very clear approach, and luckily I got that job. So the first thing led to the second thing, and
wow.
we're pretty fortunate by sort of the fall, or no, I guess it was within a year of college graduation that I landed at Blue's Clues.
Wow. That's awesome. Uh, and you clearly kind of grew within that because eventually you were the head writer on Blue's Clues.
Yeah, I mean, and I think looking back, I'm like, yeah, when you graduate from college, you think you know everything, and you think you're the smartest person in the room.
Yeah,
And I
yeah,
look back, I'm like, wow, what a right place, right time type situation to be at that age and get that opportunity. But I think what was fortunate about it is it was a show that was both kind of new and with people that were extremely creative, but hadn't most people hadn't worked on a show before, so they were kind of just finding their way, and it was growing. Like it hit really quick success, and so there was a need for people to step in. So I mean, my first opportunity to write for the show came like fairly early on when I think a freelance script was not working out, and I might have raised my hand in a meeting, said, "Hey, I could take a crack at that." And my boss Angela Santamero said, "Sure, give it a shot." So there was again, it was like that excitement of that first opportunity and be able to prove yourself, um, and yeah, and I think like just being in that growing new environment and being able to be a part of it at the not the ground level, because I came in at the very beginning of the second season when they were still finishing up animation on the first season, but to be in early was again very fortunate.
totally. And I mean, we had Angela on actually on the podcast, and she described so much of this like kind of new, a lot of newcomers who didn't really like know what they were doing necessarily, but in a good way on Blue's
Yeah,
Clues. And even she came from like a totally different angle and didn't have the like exec hat on at the time. And so it really must have been a really cool time to be on that show. Obviously, it definitely found its footing quickly and then had spin-offs, et cetera, et cetera. But at that time where, you're just trying new things, that must have been really incredible.
it really was. I mean, and I think because it wasn't all these really entrenched TV people, Nick Jr. itself was kind of new. So there was a spirit of experimentation, kind of making up the way we do this. Again, I kind of look back and I'm like, oh, some of this stuff, it's just people just taking their best guess at how things worked. But of course, Angela and the other creators had such a clear vision from the beginning. And it was so grounded in the research that you kind of had like a real guiding light to work off of. But I think looking back, especially as productions, especially in animation, have become a little more far-flung. You might work with a core group of people, but then animation is either done in another studio or sometimes it's done abroad. We had the entire team pretty much in New York, and most of them under the same roof. And
Mm.
a lot of young folks, you'd make the show together, then you'd go play on the softball team, and I think like again, not really knowing how the world worked, you're like, oh, this is how it works. You get to work with all these, all your friends, and then you play softball, and the show goes, and because it went for a while. So, but that first job for me was 5 years, which is in a sort of unheard of amount of stability, also in this world.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I also know this tangentially, but you can confirm for me if this is true. I read that you voiced the green puppy, and I followed a very heated on Angela's Instagram debate recently about whether green puppy was a boy or a girl. So, um,
Yeah, well, I mean, it's indicative of that kind of scrappy, hey, let's make a show type feeling that the show had, because I think it was just. You know what it was? It was my good friend who also worked on the show, Quayle Chanda. She was the voice of Magenta because she barked in a meeting, and she barked very well. And as maybe it lit a competitive fire. So I was like, I could bark too. And then I barked in a meeting, and Angela said, "Well, that's pretty good. Yeah, that's kind of what we want for the puppy." Now, mind you, it was a very pretty deep voice bark, so it's understandable that kids growing up didn't necessarily think, "Okay, yeah, that's a little girl dog." It's just this guy just going, "Wow," So,
that
but
is so
I
funny.
think
Wow.
it worked. I think it worked for the character.
Yeah, yeah. Let the record show we've solved the debacle. We've got the voice right here. But yeah, you were also so you were the head writer on Blue's Clues, also the head writer on Backyardigans, another show that went obviously for a really long time and had huge success. Um, yeah, on both of those shows, I think I always wonder when someone is the head writer on such a massive property, did it ever feel like those shows were running out of stories? Like, how did you kind of make sure it stayed fresh?
Yeah, I know it's kind of something that happens on every show where you wonder, oh, are we going to run out at some point? But I think what always has to happen is the writers have to kind of start thinking about the show a little bit differently or go a little bit deeper in some direction and I think what happens also is you start writing and it starts out, and on both of those shows I wasn't there in the first season, right? So
Hmm.
I kind of in a way I had a nice fresh start coming in second seasons, right? And being able to think about the
Right.
show through fresh eyes. But I think that, you take something like The Backyardigans, which the early episodes, which really delivered on the premise, were very simple play patterns that all kids would be familiar with, right? Like we're in the
Right.
backyard and we are pirates, we are superheroes, we are Vikings. It's like that's kind of what the show had to be to really show the audience, like what is this show? And then you start to get to know it and you get to know the characters. As it went on, it kind of opened up as we thought, well, these kids could be playing anything. We have buy-in now from the audience and from the network. So I think we took pleasure in coming up with these weird little mashups, right? Like I'm trying to think of an example. Like I wrote like a samurai pie maker episode where
Oh,
like
wow.
ninjas were trying to steal the samurai's pie, and there was like early on, I think there was a robot episode. Sure, that's a very classic kid play pattern. But then in the next season, there was intergalactic garbage collectors, right? Which so it was like a Star Trek episode that one of our writer producers wrote that where they would go through space and collect garbage, which if you tried to do that at the very beginning, I think the network would have been like, I don't know if that show's gonna fly. But I think once like kids know who these characters are, you trust them, they're gonna bring you along on an adventure. You can start twisting the format a little bit, and and do it that way. You know, we did like a superheroes episode early, but then as the seasons went on, you realize, okay, well, superheroes can be many things, so let's do like a hidden identity superhero episode, or you know, you start kind of just finding those other angles, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, totally. That makes a lot of sense. And did you have, while you worked on Backyardigans, like how closely did you interact with Janice Burgess?
Oh, very, very closely. I mean, that Janice,
Wow.
yeah, I mean, just every day that was my job was to sit with Janice and to think on stories and to react to scripts and to think about lyrics and yeah, she was just obviously we lost Janice earlier this
Yeah.
year, and she was just a truly a one of a kind. I mean, people say that about people, but that phrase pops to mind really easily. She was a great leader. She was she was opinionated and inclusive in equal measure, kind of, and really, I think what I learned from her, because Blue's Clues by design, and that being the first show I worked on, was it had that great breakthrough approach with research, and you would write something and you might think it's okay, and then you bring it to the kids, and the kids either like or don't like it, and you make changes based on the research, which was extremely successful for that show. But then I learned, okay, there's also another way to do it, which Janice was very aware of the audience. She
Mm-hmm.
Nick, preschool executive before she ran Backyardigans. But she also really like her guiding light, I think, was her own tastes and interests and what made her laugh, and what she was into action movies. And that's kind of how Backyardigans, every episode was sort of a different action genre. She was into music, and that's why that was a big part of it. The whole show
Wow.
sort of based on her childhood memories of playing in the backyard with friends in Pittsburgh. And so, again, it's just another way to approach something. And I think as you go through a career, you try to pull lessons from different projects that you work on. And I learned a lot from Janice for sure.
That's so cool that you have sort of all this that you gained from her. I feel like a lot of our listeners are sort of like very nostalgic for that era of kids TV,
Hmm.
and when she passed, it felt like a really big deal. And I aged myself to my boss because the news broke when I was in the office, and I was talking to another coworker of mine saying like, "Oh, did you like hear? The creator of Backyardigans. I loved that show growing up, and to be honest, I caught it on sort of the tail end of it. I wasn't in that demo for too long, but nonetheless, the my boss walked in and was like, "You watched Backyardigans," and I think we had
Yeah,
a little bit of like a generational moment there, but
sure.
I did, and it was hugely impactful. So it's very cool that um, that you were able to learn so much from her.
Yeah, and that in the show definitely had a great reach. And I've heard over the years, definitely from other parents, that their kids loved the show or would get certain songs caught in their head. And yeah, I mean, and Janet, her impact on the industry and certainly the people that work closely with her, she was absolutely beloved. So yeah, we all miss her very much.
Wow. And you've mentioned while talking about Backyardigans, the songs a lot.
Yeah.
And you were a lyricist on a lot of those songs. I
Yeah.
think you started off by mentioning that you knew it was sort of a composer in the space, but do you have a background in music? Did you have a background in music from the get-go? Like how did that come about?
No, I certainly don't. And it's interesting. Just like every writer is different, every composer, I think, approaches things differently. I've worked with composers who really need to write a song holistically. The words and the music need to come together. It's just how they write a song. The Backyardigans composers were brilliant at writing the music. They didn't really have an interest in writing the lyrics. So it wasn't mandatory that every script writer wrote lyrics. I think it's a skill that some have and some don't. And I think I'm pretty good at it, okay at it. I think there are people that are better, but I certainly learned a lot doing it on the show. There was the first season head writer, McPaul Smith, did have a music background and was a really strong lyricist. So I learned a lot from the way he approached it. But we would take a stab at the lyrics. I like thinking it's sort of like a little puzzle. I like thinking of, rhyming punchlines to make the song funny and
Mm,
sort of crafting, you to kind of craft the line. You want to end the rhyme on something that's more fun or more or funnier or whatever. And we'd write them. And then, I think one rule that the composers had was do not, then we'd all sit down around a table and we would read our lyrics out loud. And that was uh, that taught me a lot because I think it was like, don't sing us the song you have in your head, because you're going to be forcing the
yeah.
lyrics to work around some tune that you have. Just read them like a poem, and you'll know kind of as you read them out loud, are they, I guess the poetry term is scanning. Do they scan? Are you emphasizing the right syllables? Are you really forcing this line, so you read it out loud and you start to see what's really awkward and clunky, and you'd have to replace that. So I enjoyed the process quite a bit. We had some writers that were, happy to hand that off to somebody else. And, it's a mix because it's a different skill than coming up with stories and writing dialogue, but
Right.
it's something my writer brain enjoys thinking on when I can.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So I'm like, this is where my audience is going to tune out simply because I think I am yet to find someone as obsessed with this as me. But um, you had a tiny stint, or maybe it wasn't so tiny, on Lazy Town.
It was pretty
Uh,
tiny. It was tiny
okay.
in writing output, but it made an imprint in my. I can certainly tell you about the experience. Yeah.
I mean, I would love to hear it. I love that show.
Yeah, well, it's an Icelandic show. So the creator of it, this guy Magnus, is a pretty interesting guy. He was like a multi-time, I don't think that's the right phrase, but fitness champion of Europe, of all of Europe.
Oh wow.
I think for a while he was, so he had this property that existed in Iceland, and I don't know what form it took. I think it was a stage show, and it might have been books, but it was something that if you go to Iceland, everybody there knew of it. But he was determined to try to get this sold on a US broadcaster. I heard a lot of stories. He's very dynamic, and I heard just a lot of stories about him just jumping around people's offices, selling the show with all the gusto in the world. And I think his enthusiasm was infectious enough that Nickelodeon wanted to give it a shot. And Magnus also is the person that played Sporticus on the show.
Ah, mhm. Cool.
Yeah, so it was one of those things where it was starting up. There was a head writer that was not me, but it was a writer based out in LA. And a lot of times, and I was interested in getting more work as a freelancer. And a lot of the times, the way that works is just you talk to the head writer, you might have a meeting, and then you send in some pitches, and maybe they commission you to write an episode. But I learned early on the show was going to be different, which I sent in maybe a couple premises. Then I get a phone call from someone from Iceland that says, Magnus wants you to come to Iceland. I
Oh
said,
wow.
right. And I'm like, oh, well, that's new for freelance. I was like, oh, that sounds kind of fun. I was like, well, what is this trip? He's, oh, there are going to be other writers, on the show. They're going to, you'll have meetings and you'll pitch stories and you'll learn more about the show and you'll see some of Iceland. This is also in the winter where there's like 3 hours of gray and everything else is dark in Iceland. So, but um,
Wow.
but I was like, yeah, I'm up for the trip. So I took the trip, and it turns out it was so last minute that none of the other writers could come. So it was really just me in Iceland, uh, kind of being driven.
Wow.
Yeah, and I learned a lot about what they were trying to do, and I might have I don't even remember. I might have started a pitch there, but then like a month later, Magnus wants you to come back to Iceland. Oh, okay. And this time, really, other writers will be there. So then there was, a writing summit there, and it was funny. I met writers that I'm still in touch with today. I know that at one point you talked to Scott Gray, who remains like a writer friend of mine. We
Yeah.
met there in Iceland, and we like to joke that we met in the lagoon because we swam in the lagoon. You know, um, But a lot of it was, you know, Magnus is a creator that has a very specific vision. So a lot of it was just trying to absorb his vision. He would just sort of tell us, well, this character would do this and wouldn't do this. And you know, and you'd kind of try to guesswork it a little bit. And honestly, I don't even remember how many. I think I wrote one or two episodes, um but it was a fun experience, you know, to get to travel and to sort of see another angle on a project like that.
That's awesome. I think the whole thing has always just like been so like it seemed so wonky that I love hearing Scott talked a little bit about it too, and then he mentioned that it all kind of ended when Magnus, I guess is his name, decided that he wanted everyone to move to Iceland, which is so interesting to me.
Oh, that's how
Uh,
it ended. Oh, yeah.
oh, I
I
don't
mean,
know if that's how the show ended, but Scott said that that was how his involvement ended because he wasn't going to move. So,
well, he was very befuddled by the way it's often done on animated shows in the US. He's like, I don't understand how you're freelancers. Like, you know, I remember he said to us, like, Larry Bird doesn't play for different basketball teams. He only plays for one. And we're like, well,
ah,
we're not being paid to only play for one at this moment. But you know, yeah, so but he kind of he wanted people around interacting with him directly. And yeah, I mean, it might have been a situation where the budget did not allow for that type of setup. I don't
that
know.
that makes
I really
sense.
don't know
That
what the,
makes sense.
yeah.
Well, that's fascinating. Thank you for sharing
Yeah,
that.
it was a lot of fun, and it seemed like a good cast and good people working on that show for sure.
That's awesome. Well, believe it or not, I know we're coming up on our half hour mark here. So my last question for you is going to be maybe the hardest hitting one. I tell people I'm sorry that it's like making you pick a kid, but you've
Okay.
mentioned only some of the properties you've written on, but you've written on a bunch. What's been your favorite?
I know. I don't know if I can answer that. I don't think there is a singular favorite. I think, and this might be a cop out, but I do think with each project there's like something about it that I like the most, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You know, I the most recent thing I wrapped up was running this show I developed called Go Dog Go, which is just a ton of fun. It was, you know, this collection of really colorful dog characters, and I just think that creating this little community and writing this very like lighthearted, energetic series around these different dog characters was a ton of fun. You know, Odd Squad getting to be really weird and odd and you know and
Yeah.
some really good jokes on that show I think was a blast. You know, Wallykazam, another show I created, just you know, I was it's this chance to be like really absurd with words. And yeah, they all, I mean, look, I'm happy to dive in on any one of them, but I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if I could choose.
No, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. And I'm glad you mentioned some of the other ones too. Again, like um what I've realized is we kind of focus on the late 90s, early 2000s, or at
Sure.
least that's what we set out to do initially. But everyone that I speak to has obviously had such long and successful careers, and a lot of our listeners, not to make you feel old, but have kids that are watching this stuff now. So, for example, I had Keith Chapman on, and my initial, I set out to initially talk about Bob the Builder, and he was
Right.
like, we should also really talk about Paw Patrol, which we did. So,
Right.
I love that you mentioned Wally Kazam and Odd Squad, and even the most recent thing that you did, Go Dogs Go, because yeah, it's just as relevant as ever to talk about things beyond that time period and things that folks may have younger folks in their life over time who have watched that. So thank you. Yeah, that those are all awesome too. Um,
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, well it sounds it's cool to hear that those shows from, you know, the 90s have had such an impact on people like you. And I think it's cool that you're engaging in these conversations. Yeah, I guess to turn around on you, what was it that motivated you to start having these conversations?
I think what really motivated me, like I said, was a good sense of a good bit of nostalgia for sure, but also um, kind of working in the space and always wanting to pick people's brains. And knowing that, people kind of, it's interesting, our listenership has over time developed into a lot of industry people. So there are people who are drawn to it from the professional angle, and that's certainly a good percentage of it for me. And then a lot of just viewers of old content of that particular time period, those people
Yeah,
who feel that nostalgia, which is also true for me. So I think it's kind of a half and half situation.
that's great. I think it's really great.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, my pleasure.
We really appreciate it. Thanks for tuning in to Cartoon Creators. We would love if you connected with us on one of our social media channels. Have a comment, question, or an idea for a guest we should bring on to the pod? Email us at info@cartooncreators.com. Both words starting with a K, of course.